Good afternoon. You're still awake. If you're not awake, there's coffee and tea at the back and lemon bars not to be missed. So please get sugared and caffeinated as needed. I know that many of you in the room have been participating over the last 2 days in this very exciting Violence Against Women in Elections workshop, and thanks for hanging in there and having the endurance to stick with us. I really want to thank you all for being here and for participating in this important discussion. For those of you that I haven't met, my name is Dabney Evans, and I'm the Interim Director of the Institute for Developing Nations here at Emory. So today, as I alluded to, marks the end of the workshop on measuring violence against women in elections that IDN has organized in partnership with the Democracy Program at the Carter Center. IDN's mission is to convene scholars and practitioners in order to address global development issues facing the most marginalized and disadvantaged populations. And to that end, we have hosted a variety of workshops over the years in order to advance research and action in order to combat violence and poverty. And one of our most successful collaborations has been our annual workshop in partnership with the Democracy Program at the Carter Center. So we're really grateful for that collaboration and that partnership and our partners that are here today. We're also honored to host this workshop that brings together men, and there were a few men, they were commiserating at the bar last night, feeling on the periphery, as it were, not seated at the table over dinner. But there were some men participants who we're very glad to have, of course, as well as women from all over the world who are bound by the same passion, and that is the passion to end violence against women in elections. It's evident in every country, in every context, that violence, whether physical, verbal, psychological, sexual, or even systematic, is a persistent limitation to a nation's pursuit of free and fair elections and political processes. Even when the law allows a woman the right to vote, threats of violence do not allow the fulfillment of that right. This denial of a woman's full ability to participate in the political realm and take a role in the political process has a lasting impact on peace and security within states and globally. We know that when women participate in governance, there's an increase in laws and policies that better improve the quality of life of women, their families, and their entire communities. So we know that the discussion that's been taking place over the past 2 days is working towards an even larger vision for global human rights. So this workshop has sought to address barriers to women's political participation, which will lead us to finding sustainable progress towards equitable forms of governance. We dream that women are able to fully and freely participate in elections and politics. And there are even larger implications of this discussion than what we can imagine today. And I think that we're all kind of acutely aware of how timely and important free and open democratic processes are, and particularly for people that are disenfranchised, as women may often be. So we're very fortunate to be able to open up this conversation today to the public here at Emory in order for those that weren't participating to get a little glimpse of that conversation, and for our Emory community members to be able to engage in that conversation as well. So I'm pleased to turn the mic over to my colleague, David Carroll, who's director of the Democracy Program at the Carter Center, who's going to moderate this program. Dr. Carroll leads the Carter Center's initiative on developing standards and best practices in international election observation. He's observed and participated in more than 70 Carter Center projects to strengthen democracy and electoral processes around the globe in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Dr. Carroll joined the Carter Center in 1991 as the Assistant Director of the Latin America and Caribbean Program, and has directed the Center's Democracy Program since 2003. He received his PhD in International Relations from the University of South Carolina and has taught at the University of South Carolina, Georgia State University, and Sewanee, the University of the South, and we hope that someday soon, maybe he'll teach at Emory University. So please, David.
Thank you very much, Dabney. And for the Democracy Program and the Carter Center, I just want to acknowledge and thank IDN, the Institute for Developing Nations, for the great cooperation on this initiative, and also to the three panelists here who have been among the participants, and to many of the participants who are here in the room. We had about 30 people here for 2 days, and I think really good conversations about how to address the problem that Dabney summarized quite well. I'm just going to go right into the introductions. We'll hear from the panelists about 15 or 20 minutes each. We'd like to save a half hour or so for questions that any of you in the audience might have. So, with no further ado, we will start with Mona Lena Crook. Mona Lena is a professor of political science and chair of the Women in Politics PhD program at Rutgers University. She's published widely on gender quotas and women's political representation in global perspective, and also on violence and harassment against female politicians. Since 2005, she's collaborated with the National Democratic Institute on its Not the Cost campaign to stop violence against women in politics, and she was recently named an Andrew Carnegie Fellow 2017 through 2019 to research and write an academic book on this topic, featuring testimonies from women around the world. So it's been great to have her as part of this group, and we look forward to hearing from Mona Lena. Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming to learn about violence and harassment against women in politics. This is a topic that is really at the cutting edge, I think, of both academic research and practitioner approaches to thinking about women's political engagement and empowerment. In my presentation, I'm going to focus on what violence against women in politics is, why it matters, and what we can do about it. So first, we start with the question, what is violence and harassment against women in politics? So I want to start with the definition given by the National Democratic Institute. I think this is pretty fairly, we could say it's a reigning definition being used in at least practitioner work around the world. And they write that political violence can be experienced by anyone involved at any level of the political process. It affects and is directed at people of all genders around the world. However, the specific issue of violence against women in politics has three distinct characteristics. It targets women because of their gender. Its very form can be gendered, and its impact is to discourage women in particular from being or becoming politically active. If we think about this in another way, I'm sorry, I think. Oh yes, sorry. I doubted myself for a moment. So if we think about just what's the distinction here that they're talking about, political scientists have long been interested in political violence. The reason why political violence is important is that think about it as an attempt to defeat or silence a political perspective by force, right? So we can see why democratically that's very problematic, right? It's about interfering in the broader political process, right? So we see, work on terrorism, we see work on electoral violence, as well as it's so much recognized as a field, but a really important work on political harassment. This is Alicia Doan's recent book that looks at harassment at abortion clinics, right, and harassment of people based on their abortion policy support. So we know that this is problematic. What makes violence against women in politics different from this is that this is about attempts to silence and exclude women specifically, right? So it is a type of political violence, but it's really about making sure that women are not able to participate, that women's voices are not heard in the electoral process. And this is something that has not been the focus of discussion until recently, but clearly it also has those same types of political costs, right? And so it can include online violence, it can include allowing women to participate or not in political deliberations. So I think that how I want to approach this question is that we have this broad concept of violence against women in politics. But we can think about this both in terms of force or threat of force, right? What people traditionally think about as violence, as well as creation of a hostile work environment. So we usually think about this as harassment. For me, it's both of those things that fall underneath the broad umbrella of this phenomenon. But this is why I'm using violence and harassment, also thinking about them as violence as the broader category. Okay, so if we think about this, what are the different forms it takes around the world? Well, first, obviously physical violence, right? I think this is the intuitive. We can recognize this as types of violence. Could include murders, kidnappings, beatings. An example I have here is of a picture of Juana Quispe, who was a local counselor in Bolivia, who was subject to various forms of harassment that has escalated over the years until she was finally found murdered. And her death precipitated the passage of the first law in the world that criminalizes political violence and harassment against women. Sexual violence is the second type. It would involve things like rape, sexual harassment, sexualized threats. And this is something that's really come to the fore in the last few months in particular. Some cases we've seen in France in 2016, and in Canada really since 2014, they've been having a discussion about sexual harassment and sexual assault in politics. A third type is psychological violence, and that would involve things like threats, character assassination, stalking. I think online abuse often falls in this category. So there was a recent study by Amnesty International that looked at Twitter abuse against female members of parliament in the UK. And they found that it affected women across all of the political parties, but it was particularly directed at women of color in the parliament. So almost half of all of the abusive tweets that were sent at female British members of parliament were directed at one woman, Diane Abbott, who is the first black female member of parliament. Fourth type is economic violence, so that would include things like property damage or denial of salary or office. I think property damage is most commonly seen. The example I have here is a tweet showing the window at Angela Eagle's office. She was contesting the leadership of the Labour Party after the Brexit referendum in the UK, and a brick was thrown through her office window. She's also the first open lesbian in the British Parliament, so she was subject to a lot of homophobic attacks and slurs as well. The fifth type, and this is less recognized in practitioner work because it's something that is much more difficult to operationalize, but I do think it's very important to bring into our discussion. And this is what I'm calling semiotic violence. So this is about sexualized images, about sexist language that's used against female politicians. So, we see that very sexualized, even like very pornographic images are circulated, doctored images circulated on Twitter, elsewhere in the internet. We also see that there have been a lot of interesting debates in countries where you have male and female genders in the language. So across Latin America, it's been really interesting. And in Brazil, it was a huge issue. The first female president, Dilma Rousseff, she called herself presidenta. She, feminized the word, but her conservative critics kept calling her presidente. Right, the idea that it's grammatically correct to call her as if it was the male form, and it's quite interesting. It's also the Royal Spanish Academy came to a decision that they said to say male and female deputies is artificial and unnecessary distinction. Right, it's this idea that it's kind of like reminding us that this is actually a very male space, right? And this idea of bringing women into this space has raised some really interesting conflicts, right? So it's this whole range of different possibilities related to symbols and language. And all of this is really about demeaning women, right? And defending male domination, right? This is why I think it's a type of violence and harassment. Okay. So we don't have that much data yet on this phenomenon, but of course this is why we've had this discussion these 2 days. But the data we do have is very striking. In 2016, the Interparliamentary Union did a survey, did interviews with female members of parliament from all regions of the world. They were from governing and opposition parties, experienced women, newcomers, women from ethnic minorities, et cetera. And stunningly, more than 80% of those women said they had experienced some form of psychological violence. About 1/3 had experienced economic violence, 1/4 some form of physical violence, and 1/5 some type of sexual violence in the course of their work as parliamentarians. So it's not just in their lives, but as MPs that they experience these types of violence. So it's clearly something that's not uncommon, right? It really speaks to the experiences of political women around the world. So I think this is also very interesting in light of the fact that we're at a moment where we have unprecedented historic levels of female political representation around the world, right? So in the last 20 years, we've seen a doubling of women's presence in national parliaments in every region, right? And some of the regions is actually, 3 times, 4 times as many women as we had in politics before, right? And so the question is this a backlash to women's increased presence? Is it the fact there's just more women there? Or is it the fact we're talking about women's representation is opening up these experiences that have always been there? I think it sort of raises some questions, though, about whether or not we really are on the road to equality, right? That there still is this important barrier there that's preventing women from being elected, but also making it difficult for them to be politically effective. Okay, so my second question, are violence and harassment just the cost of doing politics? We could think about how we normally think about politics, right? Politics is often seen as a violent place, right? And that just being a public figure is something that comes with increased public exposure and vulnerability. I think this idea is really captured well by this quote from Winston Churchill, where he says that politics is almost as exciting as war and quite as dangerous. In war, you can only be killed once, but in politics, many times. Right, so this idea that it's just violence. So if women are entering these spaces, it would make sense that those are the kinds of experiences that they're having. We also know that people in general tend to hate politics, and by extension, politicians. So this poll that was taken in the United States, it's taken periodically, asking people if they have a higher opinion of Congress in comparison to a whole list of unpleasant things, and there's root canals and traffic jams, cockroaches, people have a higher opinion of those things than of politicians, right? Politicians are viewed more favorably than the Kardashians and gonorrhea, so maybe that's a good thing. But in general, right? So the idea is that maybe people are just hostile towards their elected representatives. This argument, though, I think is starting to change. And I think what we're seeing is increased awareness that while the public has every right in the world to criticize their elected representatives, their candidates, they should, right, for these democratic reasons, still there needs to be a line drawn when that kind of hostility goes into threats, intimidation, abuse. And these are types of behaviors that have really expanded exponentially with the rise of social media over the last few years. And the way that governments are responding is actually quite interesting. So the Swedish government put out an action plan on threats and hate against journalists, elected officials, and artists, and arguing that this is actually about protecting free speech, right? Addressing online trolling. People will say, well, but trolls have the right to free speech. Well, it's actually, they do that in order to reduce the free speech of their targets, right? And it's who has the right to free speech here? So this is about protecting free speech. And just last year, the UK Prime Minister called on the Committee on Standards and Public Life to collect evidence on abuse and intimidation of candidates in the 2017 elections. And they just produced their report at the end of December. So we're starting to think about that these are actually things that are challenging to democracy itself, right? Things that we just shouldn't accept as sort of coming with the territory of political engagement. In terms of women, we're seeing some growing evidence that targeting women for violence and harassment has had other democratic implications, particularly seeing evidence that is turning off a lot of young women from engaging in politics or pursuing politics as a career. We're also seeing that by targeting women and minorities in politics, it's really restricting the ability of those groups to pursue policies that would empower, right, all members of society. And you have politicians like Diane Abbott writing these editorials talking about how this is having policy implications, right, has a substantive representation effect. Finally, we can also think about this as a human rights question, which of course means that it's violating everybody's rights. And former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright wrote an editorial on International Women's Day in 2016, which she talked about. It's titled "The Hidden Reality of Violence Against Women in Politics." And she said that freedom is not possible in any society where women who speak out are brutalized, intimidated, or silenced. Okay, so what can we do, right? If you believe that this is a problem and it's a bad problem, I think there's quite a number of, I think, very promising new lines that are emerging. So if we look at this in terms of international organizations, a lot of international organizations are starting to talk about this. One example is a resolution that was passed unanimously at the IPU's assembly in 2016. And the resolution is called the freedom of women to participate in political processes fully, safely, and without interference. And these are the 4 articles that are included there that talk about how calling on political leaders, calling on members of parliament, calling on parliamentary officials to take steps to tackle the problem of violence and harassment directed at women. In Latin America, we've seen the passage, as I mentioned, of a law in Bolivia to criminalize political violence and harassment. We've seen at least 4 other countries introduce similar legislation. Mexico, I think, is the case where that's gone the farthest. Usually it's several times now it's been passed by one House of Parliament, and then there's, but not the other, and then there's elections, and then it's like the other House of Parliament passes it, but not the other, and then there are elections. So they've been working on that quite a bit. But it's something that has really diffused, right, thinking about legal measures that could be pursued. In Mexico, because they have had difficulties in the legal measures, so different state actors have come together to create this protocol on addressing political violence against women. And this has meant bringing together the electoral justice system with the State Institute on Women's Rights, as well as other National Electoral Institute, to develop a protocol about how they could all work together to make sure that this issue doesn't fall through the cracks. Some political parties are moving to address this as well. Liberal International, which is the international network of liberal parties around the world, made a statement to the Human Rights Council to end violence against women in politics. There's also been some work, especially in Latin America, to think about what political parties could and should be doing. Finally, and I think most interestingly, there's a lot of work being done at the civil society level, and that includes, networks of politicians and journalists coming together. So the Not the Cost campaign, the hashtag, that comes from the National Democratic Institute's global campaign to stop violence against women in politics. And the argument that they're making is that this actually violence is not the cost of women's political participation. We shouldn't accept that, right? And so the hashtag, I think, has been very important for building global awareness of violence against women in politics. We're also seeing groups like Name It, Change It, which calls out sexism, sexist media coverage, a number of groups addressing sexual harassment. We Said Enough was something that came out of work in the California state legislature, brought together legislators, staff members, lobbyists to fight sexual harassment in the California state houses. And really the point of all of this work is to, in the words of this French manifesto, to really try to break the conspiracy of silence around this issue. And so I think that what we're seeing is a lot of movement on this, and people are in many different regions of the world. And I use the French and British cases just to remind us that it's not just an issue in developing country context, but it's something that really is a global problem with growing urgency to address. So thank you so much.
So I'm going to narrow the focus a bit as compared to what Mona talked about. So Mona talked about violence against women in politics more broadly. I'm going to zoom in on elections and how gender can play a role in elections, and how we can rethink about how we look at, observe, and assess elections with a gender lens on elections. And these are reflections that are based on a project that's very much ongoing. I have conducted a pilot study in the Maldives within this project in collaboration with IFES. I have conducted a study in Myanmar with a survey of candidates and also qualitative interviews with candidates, as well as a survey of election stakeholders more broadly in Myanmar. And I am going to, in a few weeks, go to Sri Lanka to collect what I hope will be the biggest and most systematic survey of candidates in elections. So none of these projects are finished yet. It's a big project with many sub-projects, so these are really reflections from an ongoing analysis, what I think we may be able to learn from this project. A few words about the design of this whole project. So the main focus is on candidates' experience. And I'm well aware that there are many, many other important stakeholders that we need to look at when we observe elections. But to kind of focus on one group that is clearly identifiable, that we know have a relation to the election, and that we can identify and survey, is, I think, a good way forward in an emerging field like this, where it's still very difficult to identify who exactly do we need to talk to and what are we basing our conclusions on. So at least with focusing on candidates, we know they are stakeholders in the election, and violence and harassment that they experience during the election phase is not necessarily, but highly likely to be connected to the election. Importantly, I'm focusing on both elected and non-elected candidates. I do this research after the election has taken place so that I can survey and discuss experiences that take place during the campaign phase as well as during election day. I don't capture as much of the post-election phase, but the important thing is also, if you want to capture candidates' experience, you need to capture them while they still identify as candidates. And that's, of course, particularly true for the non-elected candidates who have actually experienced a defeat and who may not even want to talk about their experiences. So if you try to approach them quite close to the election, there will still be organizations who have worked with them as candidates, and they will still be able to be identifiable and to be able to reach out to. My focus is very, very clearly gendered. And for that reason, I would say, I focus on both male and female candidates. I do this for a number of reasons. First of all, to be able to compare the experiences of male and female candidates, but also to see if there are experiences and types of violence that is gendered, either male or female, and what kind of manifestations we might see when it comes to gender aspects of violence. And as I said, pre-election phase and election day is what I focus on. The kind of theoretical starting point of this is coming from the field of election violence, but also trying to reassess the way that we look at election violence and why election violence matters. Because when we look at violence, I mean, it's always violence as a violation of personal integrity is always a problem. But when it's election violence, there's another aspect to it as well, and it's the fact that it actually violates electoral integrity as well. So it's both the electoral integrity and the personal integrity that's at stake here. So it's this double problem that I'm interested in when these two intersect. And whereas electoral violence is usually identified by its motive. So when you look at academic studies of election violence, you have the definition there that it's supposed to be an act of violence with the intention of changing the outcome of the election. So that's one important aspect here. That's what I'm looking at as well. But I'm also adding a criteria about the means of violence. The means of violence here is about violating personal integrity. And when we look at violations of electoral and personal integrity rather than election violence, it becomes to me quite clear that we can't just focus on physical violence. There are many ways of violating a person's personal integrity, having the intention of affecting the outcome of an election that does not just include physical violence. So harassment, threats, rumor spreading can also be a way of trying to affect the outcome of the election, and it's certainly hurtful to personal integrity. So if we try to look at it from that perspective, we get a broader range of activities, and we also gain a more gender-sensitive approach to election violence. And so why then is a gender-sensitive approach to election violence and to elections in general needed? Well, the present methods mask a masculine gender bias, which means that there's a way of underestimating the overall prevalence of violence. If we are focusing on physical incidents of violence, and that is a form of violence that mainly male candidates experience, we are going to not see, we're going to make invisible a lot of the types of acts that actually do both affect a person's personal integrity as well as the electoral integrity. And of course, we also risk designing programs that are then involuntarily designed to tackle male experiences of violence. Again, so the ways in which we work against this will not work with the broad range of violent acts that take place. So gender, of course, matters in a multitude of ways when it comes to violence. And it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly when and where and how gender matters. And I think it's often empirically almost impossible to do so, but at least analytically, it's important that we try to think about the ways in which violence, in which gender plays a role in the violence that we see. So together with Gabrielle, who's sitting here, and Jennifer Piscopo, we have worked with an analytical way of trying to think, well, first of all, is gender in the motive of the violent act? If so, it's gender motivated. That's the type of violence that's conducted because one does not think that women should be in politics, because it is a woman. So the kind of argument we have to make when we categorize an act as being gender motivated is, well, would this same act of violence have happened to a male candidate? Or would it not? But even if it's not gender motivated, it may be the fact that gender is in the form. So if we try to think from the point of view of a perpetrator, there's actually a cost-benefit analysis there. It's quite risky to go out and attack a candidate physically. It's visible. You might be caught. You might be hurt. So if you can reach the same effect by attacking someone online, claiming that this person has a moral character that's not suited for politics, by claiming that this person has had an affair with someone, then that's perhaps a quite smart thing to do. If you reach the same, if you can still destroy a person's career by using a gendered form of violence that is going to be more efficient with female candidates as opposed to male candidates, that's a gendered form of violence. It's not motivated by the gender, but it's a strategy that's used for the gender. And even if it's none of those, gender can still be in the impact. So by seeing violence, women can be can think that politics is not a place for me. Even if a woman is attacked and it's not because gender was in the motive or in the form, it can still impact on other women. It can still be interpreted in ways that are certainly very, very gendered. So this is not an easy thing to unpack, but it's also an important way, I think, of showing how gender matters in so many ways. So we really can't disregard it when we look at election violence. I'm just going to go through some very simple, in one way, guiding questions about things that I think we should think about when we assess elections. And they're simple in the case that it's what, who, where, when, and how. So we need to think about what are we asking questions about, and how can we make that more gender sensitive? Who are we asking? Where are we looking? When are we asking? And finally, how are we asking? So what are we asking? This goes back very much to what Mona talked about. So different types of violence may affect men and women differently. And if we just ask in very general terms about, well, did you experience violence? We cannot be sure that we actually capture the full range of experiences. Violence means different things in different contexts. And if we focus, as a lot of election violence literature has done, on seeing publicly visible incidents of violence, we will end up focusing on the physical violence. That's the first category there. But if we are aware of the different types of violence that men and women are victims of in elections, but also more widely in the society at large, we know that physical violence physical public violence in particular is a very male experience of violence. Physical violence that women experience more often take place in the private sphere. But we also see that psychological violence is one of the main types of violence that women face. We also have economic violence, and then I put sexual violence lower down, not because I don't think it's important, rather because I think it can be seen as a category to all of the above. You can really think particularly about physical violence and psychological violence as both having sexual aspects that need to be taken into account. So just to show you a bit about how asking about different forms of violence may matter for how we assess elections. This is just some descriptive statistics from the survey in Myanmar. And if we look at the physical violence, which is normally what we would assess, 28% of election stakeholders, so this was a quite large number of election stakeholders, not just candidates, but a broader set of stakeholders, both election commissioners, election observers, election officials, political party officials, candidates, and civil society representatives. And they were asked if they thought that these activities occurred, if they perceived that these activities occurred during the election. And so 28% thought that physical violence occurred. But if we then look at sexual violence, which is not always mentioned there, if we look at the psychological forms of violence, we see that those are actually perceived to be far bigger problems. And that may be, again, as detrimental both to the victim itself, but certainly to the electoral process. So if we don't specifically ask for those forms of violence, we will miss out on a lot of activities that take place and that are violating electoral integrity. We can also disaggregate this data and see that some of these are more relevant to women than to men. In the ones that are colored red here is where we have a significant difference between male and female respondents. So certainly when it comes to libel of sexual nature and threats, women were far more likely to experience, or I should say the people surveyed perceived that women were far more likely to experience this. When it comes to the illegitimate means by government, it's kind of surprising to me, and here the difference is actually really big. 53% of women said that they perceived that the government used illegitimate means, and 29% of men said the same thing. The only reasonable explanation I've heard for this is that the government party, the military party USDP, used a door-to-door campaign, whereas NLD, the party that then went on to win the election, used big rallies. And so if we think again about the gendered structure, it's likely that women are more at home. They are the ones that open the door. Again, this is not gender-motivated violence in the sense that they were thinking, I don't think, of targeting and intimidating women, but the structures of society made it so that the ones who were approached by the government party were actually women. We can also see some differences if we look at disaggregate between participants, politicians in the elections, and those who were more observing the elections. and politicians were more likely to have experienced libel and damage to property directly. When we think about this question about what we ask for, we also need to take into account the context and the fact that violence and harassment in many contexts become normalized to the extent that people do not even consider it to be violence or harassment when you ask about it. In the survey in the Maldives, I had specific questions for all of these different forms of violence, and yet a woman, after having filled out the survey, said she wanted to talk to me, and she said, well, I just wanted to let you know that I put no on all of those questions because it's everyday things. It happens every day, so I didn't think it was worth noting down. So in the way that violence can become normalized to the extent that people don't see themselves as victims because it's what happens to everyone else, it's the cost of politics, right? Really makes it tricky for us as researchers to make sure that we capture the violence and the harassment that does take place and that certainly affects these candidates. There's not a question about that these activities affected her on a daily basis, but nevertheless, she didn't report them as something out of the ordinary, which she thought I was asking for. So from that point on, I make a very explicit, even if it happens every day, please, I'm interested in knowing about it, both in writing on the survey and when I introduce the survey. Moving on to who. Who should we ask for information? Should we only focus on the victims? Should we only focus on women victims maybe? As I already said, my strategy here has been to focus on a set of defined stakeholders in this project candidates to be able to say something about the prevalence in that specified group, to be able to really ascertain that the people who say who do not report violence by themselves actually do not experience violence even by my standards and the way that I measure violence. And also, I think a lot of the violence that we see in mainstream election violence is also gendered violence. It's just gender to the masculine. And it's important to start naming men as men and to start naming masculine experiences not as political experience, but actually as masculine experiences. Some of the things you can see when you gender disaggregate the data is that you can start to actually see, well, what are the types of things that women experience more than men, or vice versa, which is not actually the case in this, apart from the fact of violence against others. So male candidates said that their supporters experienced more violence than the female candidates did. But the very kind of strong difference here is in libel of sexual nature again, where a significant larger number of women experienced this than did men. So by doing this, we can see both that, yes, for instance, libel and rumors is a very big problem, 77% of candidates. Libel of a sexual nature is a slightly smaller problem, but whereas libel rumor is a big problem for both men and women, libel of a sexual nature is a female problem to a large extent. So if we work with election campaigns, we need to work with libel and rumors for all candidates if we want to preserve electoral integrity. But the sexual nature is a particular gendered aspect that needs to be worked with in a somewhat more gender-sensitive way. One difficulty of doing this is in some cases we have very, very few women in politics. So in the Maldives, even getting women that would be enough to actually do any statistics on was really, really difficult. And I didn't really reach the target, so I really had to cluster the groups and try to think about, okay, I need to get all the women I can get and a comparable number of men as well. So in the Maldives, 7.6% of candidates were women, and there are 5 MPs in the parliament, and you see them all in this picture. Some of the things that you do find when you start looking at the difference between men and women is really that Well, the images and the types of harassment that men and women meet are different and map onto different understandings of masculinity and femininity. So again, in the study of Myanmar, you can see that many of the female candidates said that the rumors that were detrimental to their careers and to their campaigns and that they had online was about them having an affair or was about them being sexually promiscuous. When I asked the men about this, they mostly chuckled and say, no, that wouldn't hurt me, and it didn't happen. And they instead told stories about religious intolerance and how they would be accused of doing business with the Muslim community, being terrorists, and instead tapping onto other inequalities and intolerances in the Myanmar society that maps on to men. I will end by saying just a very few short things about the remaining questions. If we want to do a gender-sensitive analysis and think about the question of where, we need to move away from the geographical mapping that's really looking at the publicly visible types of violence, and also find ways to move into violence that takes place in private spheres. Several of my respondents told me how they were dependent on their husbands for being able to run a campaign, and how their husbands divorced them when these rumors started to take place, for instance. To internal party dynamics, I had a respondent who received a rape threat by a colleague in her party, telling her that he would rape her on the floor of the house. And to social media, of course. Social media is not geographically mapped, but it's a major, major site for harassment, which Gabrielle will talk about more soon. When? A lot of the violence that was reported takes place in the pre-election phase. And so we can't focus on election day if we want to understand what's going on. How? When we do research about this, there are, as in any project, but perhaps specifically here, research ethics that we need to think about. What do survey questions do to respondents? Do we victimize them by telling them that they're victims? Can we secure the environment in which questions are asked so that it does not become obvious that they are reporting things that have happened to them? I think this is actually easier if you do both men and women, because you can do it in party settings and you can do it as a part of trainings that are taking place anywhere. You can raise awareness of this as a problem, but also potential victimization or re-traumatization. And cooperation with an organization, in my case mostly IFES, really I think enhances the accountability of this project. So that's I think is a good aspect, and the responsible use of the results, because I'm conducting research that hopefully the organization will want to use somehow. So this is then just a summary of what a gender-sensitive approach to election violence can do. Specifically ask about different forms of violence, encourage speaking up, ask both victims and non-victims, women and men. Ask about non-public or semi-public arenas, ensure presence in the pre-election phase as well, and ask in a gender-sensitive and secure manner, and follow up if possible. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and the Carter Center and IDN for having us here today. It's an exciting opportunity to talk about a topic that is touching an innumerable amount of women worldwide and is really impacting the quality of our democracies. So, as David said, I've now been working in this field for nearly 15 years of democracy assistance and elections, and it's been nearly 10 years talking about violence against women in elections. And I think the deeper we go into this topic, the deeper it becomes, and the layers keep peeling back and revealing both the complexity of it, the severity of it, and also new opportunities within it. And I'm here today to talk about yet another layer that we've peeled back to, which is political violence, electoral violence, gender, and cyberspace, and information communication technologies, ICTs. So in the next few minutes, I'd like to talk about, first of all, why ICTs are important in this field and what is specific about them that really needs to concern us where this topic of violence against women in politics is, what it looks like in the cybersphere, and that's another layer that we are continuing to peel, And possibly, most importantly, what can we do about it? So let's get started. There are several definitions of what violence against women in politics and in elections looks like in the field today. My academic research looks at this both as a form of electoral violence and then as a very gender-specific, gender-based form of violence. So I take my research from a point of departure that has a gender-sensitive definition of election violence. Political violence and the subset of electoral violence is a means of controlling or oppressing an individual's or group's right to participation in political processes and institutions through various forms of force: emotional, social, economic force, coercion, pressure, as well as physical and sexual harm. This takes place in different spaces. This is a definition that's based on the international definition of violence against women and gender, but we need to understand that it operates equally in the political and electoral sphere. Connected to that, we see the existence of gender-motivated forms of political and electoral violence. This type of harm is a harm that violates either an individual or a group's political rights on the basis of their gender identity. We talk about this specifically about women in particular because they are overwhelmingly the most visible victims in the world today, although we recognize that this form of violence exists against other non-dominant gender identities as well. So this topic of violence against women in elections and politics is a form of gender-motivated political violence that specifically targets women in order to enforce a patriarchal control of democratic institutions. So, talking about election violence and violence against women, what do we know? We've talked about it already a bit. There are specific types of violence. It's physical, it's sexual, it's psychological, it's economic. There are specific victims as well. These include political actors, obvious candidates, political parties, people engaged in political involvement in that way. Institutional actors as well, security forces, police forces are really prominent up there among who's perpetrating this type of issue. Professional and non-states and non-political groups. These are all types from journalists to others, as well as private and non-political groups. These are, sorry, I'm talking victims, but likewise for perpetrators. So I'll hit perpetrators. The perpetrators likewise are similar, but they're equally diverse in that regard as well. We know that this violence takes place during the pre-election period, the post-election, as well as on election day itself. And most importantly, perhaps for the conversation today, is where it takes place. It takes place in private locations, it takes place in public locations, in the domestic space, which can kind of bridge those. But most importantly for us, it takes place in a cyber location. So let's talk really specifically about what it is about information communication technology, about cyberspace, that makes it really uniquely toxic for women's political participation. It makes it an enabling space for violence against women in elections and politics. First of all, let's talk about the volume of attacks, the severity of these attacks. Hitting like on an obnoxious Facebook post or retweeting something, these are tiny things. People don't think about them. They chuckle a little bit and move on with their day. But on the receiving end, we're seeing victims of this violence that are receiving hundreds of death threats, of rape threats per hour in some of these cases. This is overwhelming. It is about the volume of these incidents that's coming in that makes them so damaging and distressing. So we're looking at something that is not just individually incident-based, that's not linked to a specific perpetrator, but that is pervasive, that is consuming, that's terrifying for its victim because of the nature of it. Who to turn to, who to ask for help, who to prosecute in this, because it can be thousands and thousands of perpetrators in this case. We also see that women can be exceptionally vulnerable to this type of attack for a number of reasons. There's a technology gap, especially in many of the countries where I'm working with IFAS today, where internet penetration is limited. It's often limited especially to elites, to urban areas, to this and that, so there's divides in these spaces, and women may have less access to it, less resources to invest in sufficient security structures, less familiarity with how to become secure in cyberspaces, and otherwise. So there's a technology gap that exists in especially countries that are coming out of civil wars and are going through transitions. There's also the question of the importance of morality and ethical concerns for women. And as much as we'd like to pretend that we are in an equal society and that these attacks, hit men and women all the same, the impact just isn't. Again, especially in these transitional democracies, women's traditional roles as the moral guardians, as the moral role models for their children, as the protectors of the family in that sense, are really strong. And their vulnerability to being attacked on those bases is just different from what men experience. And it's as Ellen said, when a man is attacked for having an affair, for having misbehaved sexually or otherwise, up till now at least, the impacts of that have been relatively limited. For women, however, being attacked either, for sexual misbehavior, misconduct, or for a deviant sexual identity, which is really common, can really have devastating impacts as well. The importance of psychological and non-physical attacks on women. This has been mentioned by all of my colleagues. My research shows it as well. Women are experiencing up to 3 times as much psychological, non-physical intimidation and threats. And by nature, anything that's happening in online spaces is non-physical. And so we know that that's the form of violence that impacts women, and that's where this is going on. The pervasiveness of images. I was in Tunisia at one point talking to women parliamentarians, and they were saying, I can barely listen to what's going on the floor of parliament. I kind of rush in and out because these guys are out there taking photos right and left, and then they manipulate them online, and they turn them into pornographic images, or they ridicule this, or if my hair's out, or if my ankle is showing too much or something, and these images are so powerful, and women are being judged on them in ways that men just simply are not. So they can be real images that are used to mock, or especially photoshopped images. The speed of this, you can have thousands and thousands of hits on an image before any type of action can be taken, if any type of action can be taken, and the damage is done. We have to remember that within the electoral sphere in particular, we're working against the clock, and your reputation can be gone in a heartbeat, and maybe you won that case down the line 6 months or 6 years from now, but you've definitely lost the election, and you might have destroyed your political career. So these attacks happen really fast, and they're really damaging, and we don't have much we can do about it. The question of impunity, the question of regulation is total Wild West. During our talks over the past few days, we started mentioning different types of violence, and I'll talk about it in a moment. We don't even know we don't know how to spell them, let alone know what they mean, or how to regulate against them and make them illegal crimes because of the way that they're attacking women in particular. So this is really just a field of impunity. And likewise, kind of the inverse, not only elevating these negative and aggressive, abusive images of women, but also the ability of the internet to silence women. This works in opposite ways as well, and we really need to be aware of that. So what does violence against women in cyberspace look like? And what kinds of data can be collected regarding this type of violence in online spaces? So we've talked about the kind of traditional typology that we've been working with now since 2011, physical harms, non-physical harms, bodily harm, etc. Those things are happening in the physical sphere, in real life sphere, but they happen in cybersphere as well. And we can kind of begin to classify the existence of different types of acts in that framework. So for example, in terms of bodily harm, well, for all of these, I'll step back, threats relating to any of these 4 categories that happen in the online sphere can be easily connected to that typology. But some of them are crossing the lines as well. So for bodily harm, for example, the case of proposing threats online, encouraging other people to attack the person in real life, we can cross out of the cybersphere and into the home. It's called doxing, I guess, where you're giving out private information about the person's physical home address or their other identity and encouraging people to come and bother them or harm them physically. Clearly, the amount of sexual information going on the websites is outrageous. The political porn, the stalking, all of these different things. I had I won't say the pleasure, it was the strange circumstance a few years ago to be talking about this issue. And I didn't have to do screenshots or anything of examples. We just pulled up Twitter and typed in Hillary Clinton, it was during the campaign, and expletive, and just watched them roll in. the sexual nature of these things is extraordinary, is all I have to say. So, all of these things do begin to appear across the categories that we've already identified in the more traditional areas. Physical, I can't use physical because it's a category, but the in real life categories also are happening online. But as I said, there's all of these other internet-specific types of harm that we're only just beginning to recognize today. So we're just starting to work with this, but all of these different types of online-specific behaviors that we're still trying to classify according to these 4 main fields, but they all appear. We have everything from Google bombing, flaming, doxing, defamation, cross-platform harassment. Don't even ask me to explain all of these now because I'm still learning also. Complex forms of either intimidation, sexual demeaning, defamation, physical attacks that are occurring in ways that we've never even considered before. And this is something that we need to grow with. So what can we do about it? A lot, actually, and we're finding out more every day. First of all, we need to track it. We need to try to record it. IFAS, in partnership with NDI, is working on initiatives in this area. We're working with what we call sentiment analysis, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a software tool, essentially, that gauges opinion by going through social media and understanding users' perceptions of various subjects. In this case, it'll be men and women engaged in political life in various areas, to understand the presence of aggression, abusive behaviors, and other types of harms, and more, of course. There are ways that we can respond to it. That includes various legal protections. As I said, we need to start defining and understanding what these specific types of harms are and then legislating on them. Found out the catfishing, I guess, if you know what that is. There is the first and only catfishing law, apparently, is in Oklahoma, a leader. And this type of legislation is waking up to these new realities and legislating on them, and that can become models elsewhere. Laws about data preservation as well. Working with the regulatory online environment and working with the platforms themselves that are hosting these spaces where this violence is occurring. We can work on preparedness and security for the women in particular that are most vulnerable to these things. We can work on resiliency as well. Because as I said, so much of this is happening so quickly and in a political electoral time frame that we need to respond and to move on in many cases. And there are an amazing wealth of sources happening in this field worldwide today. One of them we heard about in the past 2 days, HeartMap, which is allowing women to talk about the online harassment they experience and then relate to a community that can provide support, encouragement, that they need to just power through and keep going, which is a really helpful thing. We can denounce it, and we can promote sensitization campaigns, and also work with groups that are most susceptible and also most influential with many of the perpetrators in this field to stop it. So that includes codes of conduct for political parties, codes of conduct for election management bodies, and things like this to regulate behavior and to change the norms around this type of thing. And my last point is we as researchers need to adapt our methods to this because it doesn't look like what we've done in the past. When I started out with IFAS, we were doing election violence monitoring, and you would train 500 people to spend 8 months in the field monitoring with paper and collecting these things and carrying them across the country. And this is not that day anymore. That wasn't that long ago, really not long ago. So we need to adapt really quickly, not only the physical tools that we're using to collect and analyze this information, but also the theoretical and conceptual frameworks that we're using to study it. So I will stop there and bring it to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. So we have about 20 minutes for questions. Before I turn it to the audience, I just wanted to quickly say that so the meeting that we had the last 2 days, there was about 30 people participating. A number of them are in the audience here with us. It was, I think, a relatively unique gathering, probably not the first, but maybe relatively unique in that we had both groups that work as international observers, citizen domestic observers, academics, election assistance providers, think tank experts around the table to talk about this very specific issue and to say what can we do about this with a particular focus on what can we do to get more data and to try to help use that data in ways to address the problem. A couple of things that I think are outcomes from this meeting. At a very high level, we've made a commitment to raise awareness that violence against women in elections is part of electoral integrity. This has to be understood as an issue of electoral integrity. We need to gather more data on all of these aspects of this problem, but importantly, we need to make much better use of the data that we're already gathering and have in our different institutions and spheres. And related to that, better analysis of that data and better action-oriented recommendations, because we have a lot of this data. We need to make better use of it. And looking forward, we've agreed that we're going to try to collaborate going forward and maintain some kind of a network to see what we need to do as this group, informal right now, to try to continue to raise awareness and hopefully try to address this problem. So please, questions to any of the panelists. I know these are some of the foremost experts on this particular problem in the world at this point, and I'd love to hear questions that you might have to any of them. I'm sure they would be happy to respond. Yes.
I have a question for Alex. I was wondering, within your surveys and other interviews and other fieldwork experience, you mentioned how some of the tactics may be substitutions for one another or complementary to one another. And I was curious if the respondents were able to identify their perpetrators or the affiliation of perpetrators, and if different groups perpetrating various types of violence, whether they would typically use one strategy or multiple strategies, and if you had any sort of evidence about how they were being used to substitute one another.
Should I respond right away?
I think so. Go ahead,
Yeah.
and then after that, we'll see if there's a cluster of questions.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I mean, getting to the reason for perpetration and is really, and the motive behind the act is really important, but also really, really difficult. So yes, I do have data on who they think perpetrated. I also tried to ask about if they had perpetrated any of the above themselves. Unsurprisingly, very few claimed they had. And I think I'm reluctant to kind of do much about it because I think it's very different in different types of violence. I mean, the certainty with which you actually know who perpetrated the violence. So if we look at social media, if we look at gang mobs, in the Maldives there were a lot of gangs who people said they knew who were behind, and it wasn't really the people perpetrating the violence who was the kind of brain behind that deed. So it's really, I mean, even if you ask for it, and even if you ask about who they think it is, I think it's difficult to do anything about. But I will look more into it as well, and we continue to ask about, and I hope in a better way in Sri Lanka, where we have more systematically a question about who you think perpetrated each act, and I hope more relevant categories, because that's also the tricky part of actually getting the relevant categories of perpetrators in different contexts.
More questions from the audience?
Thank you. My name is John Wamwara. I'm Kenyan, studying at Emory Law School. My question is and to any member of the panel, is politics inevitably violent? And if there are good examples of certain good practices that others can learn from different parts of the world as well, that also you could highlight so that we could read or study more or look up to them as well. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't quite hear it. What did you?
I mean, is politics inevitably violent? And if there are good, I mean, no. I think especially democratic politics is actually supposed to be a way of solving conflicts without resorting to violence. So I think certainly not. It shouldn't be, and we can't accept that as a standard. But I think it's on the other hand, certainly an arena where we're likely to often see violence of different forms. And because it is about power, about winning elections, about defeating in some way your opponents, it's also easy to reinvent kind of new ways to win. And I think the social media aspect is exactly what we're seeing there. That it's a new way of being able to defame your opponent or kind of get a shortcut to a result that you would like to see. But I certainly don't think that politics is inevitably violent, and I think there are a number of political spheres that are not. I mean, it's society, so there will always be problems of inequalities and structural violence and individuals that are violent. But it's we need to work against that.
Though I think it is interesting. There have been high-profile, political assassinations, for example, in the UK, for example, a couple of years ago, Jo Cox, female member of parliament, or Anna Lindh, the Swedish defense minister, in 2003, and and what's interesting is people's reactions to that is almost like it's like almost more shocking, right? In these sort of very, very established democracies, and it is happening. But I think the example, because it's so rare, right? That's I think part of the reasons why it has greater shock value. But there does seem to be something also about this political moment that's really, I think, a lot of political polarization in a lot of countries, and there's a lot at stake, right? In politics, people get, angry and upset, and I think that's true. But I think there's a broad acceptance that the violence is bad, right? So I think that the goal is to try to, spread awareness that isn't something that should just be accepted and explained away, right? And I think that's sort of part of this work is trying to do that.
No, I would say, politics is the contest for power, which is an inherent contest. And democracy is the institutionalizing of a peaceful transition and competition for power. So the more we move towards democracy, the more peaceful transitions of power that we're hoping to have. We also need to recognize that violence is constantly changing in nature, in parallel to that democratic contest. I think what we're seeing with women in politics today and violence against women in politics in many ways reflects what we're seeing kind of in the broader conversation about democracy and elections globally. We're seeing a question of delegitimization of political actors, of political institutions, which is particularly worrying, and a lack of public confidence in democracy worldwide. We're attacking the image and the perception of these bodies that allow us to have a peaceful transition of power. And that's what we're seeing with women as well. There's certainly many physical forms of violence that women are experiencing, but one of the reasons that cyber violence is so persuasive is because it's attacking that image, that perception, that confidence in women. And so all of these things are interconnected and they're happening in parallel. The last part of your question was about, where can we look for examples? I would say, start with Kenya, among other places. I mean, 10 years ago, Kenyans, in the face of the terrible violence, which I was there to witness, launched Ushahidi, right? The program that was allowing crowdsourcing of violence to recognize where things were happening, when, why, how. And that was revolutionary, and it has been worldwide now, not only for election violence, but elsewhere. And it's enabled us to understand the nature of violence and to address it more effectively, and it's taken on a life of its own. And so solutions are everywhere. Solutions are, where there's need, we find ways also. And I think that type of innovation is where we should be looking.
Sorry. Go ahead, Saskia, and then we have another question here. Go ahead, please, Saskia.
Yeah, my question relates directly to what you just said. I'm curious because in the literature on just election violence in general, there have been attempts to look at subnational variation, right, to try and understand what are some of the root causes, why is it worse in some regions than in others. I'm wondering if there's, in your studies or in other studies on this issue, whether you've seen attempts to look at kind of subnational variation in violence against women in politics as well, or whether that's just impossible at this point given the data we have. Well, I don't know with your survey whether you were able to see some of those patterns, and whether you think that might be an avenue for understanding also some of the root causes or potential solutions.
Let's get another question, and was there one over here too? Yeah, okay, let's get all three of them maybe.
Yes.
Here's a microphone.
Yes, I'm not sure if this might be very clearly answerable, but it sort of builds on the question of the perpetrators. I'm thinking of what could be some potential strategies and solutions for closed authoritarian contexts. So the example that I'm thinking of is that in 2016, 18 women were elected to the Iranian parliament, but it ended up being 17 women because one of them, after the elections, the state, basically the higher authorities of the state, declared her candidacy illegal, and therefore she could no longer, and there was no way of contesting it. There was, it was, for the general public, it was quite obvious what was going on, but in that, so I'm just wondering, places where election observers and all that is closed off.
Okay, and then the third, and then we can let the panel respond as they would like.
I had a question that was a bit specific to Ellen's study, but maybe applicable to the others as well. And it was if you saw a systematic difference in the experiences of successful female candidates and male candidates and the non-successful, because I could imagine on one hand perhaps more viable candidates are seen as a bigger threat and therefore they receive more of this violence, or the women who were not successful are maybe more willing to speak about the violence because it's no longer potentially going to damage their political career if they've left politics.
Should we start with that one, Ellen, on that particular one, and then you can respond to the other questions as well, and then go through the panel?
Great. Yes, so I have looked at successful and unsuccessful candidates, and at least in the Maldives case, it's quite clear that there's no gender difference, but there's a strong difference between people who have experienced violence of any form are more unsuccessful. So they do not win. So it's actually, it's working, and it's working regardless from the point of view of the perpetrator, of course. It's working. So they are less likely to actually win regardless of whether it's psychological violence taking place online or physical attacks. So I haven't looked at the gender aspect, or actually there are too few people in each category, and that's actually the problem for the sub-regional. I do have a quite big regional spread, and I look at the local elections in Sri Lanka, so there I'll have a large regional spread, but there will be very few people since I'm looking at candidates from every region. So the question is to what extent you can actually say something about regional variation. I think in election violence studies that would look more broadly at incidences or voter experiences, or that would be more possible way forward to actually look at regional differences with any certainty.
Anything on the closed authoritarian societies question?
Let's see, remind me again, what was, and your question was?
So when you have the perpetrators of the violence against women be sort of state institutions.
Oh, right, yes. So that's another question that actually came up as part of the pilot that I didn't originally include in the survey, but several of the people told me you have to include the state, government repression. That is something that is very important. My dad lost his job, or all kinds of things that happen. So that is something that we are now incorporating, and that I think is also part. It's also part of another project that I have on electoral authoritarian settings, where we're going to look much more closely at that. So I don't have any results on that yet, but it's a very important question that I will look more into.
Yeah, the question about subnational politics, I think, is really important. The Bolivian legislation, interestingly, was a result of mobilization by locally elected women. who were experiencing violence and harassment. And they started to, connect to each other, and they started to realize it wasn't just them, right? And it was largely women from the rural areas, women in indigenous communities that really experiencing the violence. So I think that really, was the impetus or the origin of the discussion across a lot of Latin America. But even in Sweden, the government action plan I talked about, actually, that light was thrown on the issue of violence against politicians by the local and provincially elected officials. And so I think that there is this whole area of research that could be done. And I had done some interviews in Sweden a few months ago, and the argument was that, well, parliamentarians, there's a whole parliamentary, security apparatus. For people at local level, what makes us so vulnerable is that, there's not a lot of security, right, into the, the various town halls. But also, especially in small communities, people know where you live. They know where your child goes to school, right? Like, it's the religious centers where they're posting, defamatory images and things like this. And there's a high cost, right, to being socially ostracized, right, and targeted in those types of communities. So I think there's a lot of, a lot of evidence that things are happening there. There's a lot of work that we could do. On the closed authoritarian regimes question, I think, in case of Iran, but even, Rwanda, I think the presidential candidate, a woman had, was subject to a lot of mistreatment that prevented her from, waging her campaign. And the way that I think about this is that I think there's a shared problem of violence against women in politics across all countries, but the actual manifestations of repertoire is different depending on the tools that we have. So, like the moral and ethical dimension, right? Like that becomes really important in these like small, very religious, communities and societies. When you think, compare what would happen in Iran versus what happens in Australia, right? There's still misogyny and sexism driving this, but, Australia, it might be online, media-centered attacks, where in a place like Iran, right, it's very much state-sponsored types of attacks, right? So it's kind of thinking about how we map out all the different ways that this can play itself out. It's all the same phenomenon, right? But there's different tools. You could also think about impunity, right? And a lot of times in Mexico, right? People who commit crimes, there's large-scale impunity for crimes, whereas like in Sweden, it would be much harder, right, for people to get away with that, right? So I think that there's a lot of the, opportunity that creates opportunities and constraints, right, on perpetrating this kind of violence. And finally, just on the successful versus non-successful, I actually think the dynamic goes both ways. And I can't remember now, if I were to pull up my computer, I would get it, but there was one country where like over 80% of the candidates dropped out during the course of the election because of violence, right? And so they're kind of out of, they never had a chance to succeed, right? Like so, or they never reached the final contest. But on the other hand, what we're seeing is that more prominent, women who figure more prominently, right? So women in leadership positions, women who've been featured in the media, that's when the attacks really happen, right? So I think it's like the super successful and visible, but also the people who've fallen out are really kind of the two sides of that issue.
So regarding subnational, the answer is yes and no. IFAS's data on election violence is all disaggregated by, it's geotagged. Most emerging and well-established groups are, geotag their data as well. They're integrating gender issues, so there's that. When we did the cross-national comparison, in order to just have a sense of things, we categorized victims as rural or urban centers, that type of thing, and we did find some results from that. Women in rural locations came up much more frequently as victims, but that said, I wouldn't trust all of this data too far yet. I don't think it's refined enough for a couple of reasons. We didn't know enough about violence against women in elections when it was conducted. What we know now shows us that the types of violence that women are experiencing aren't collected by these types of processes. And also, election violence is a wily beast. And certain data collection methods will only work within a certain intensity of election violence. if the level of election violence or the nature of it is too low, the tool won't pick it up, and if it's too high, it'll explode a data collection system. So really hard, but it's basically out there. That said, I think there are other cross variables that we really do need to be looking at this. The geographic distribution, subnational is certainly one. Intersectional identities, again, we need to be looking at women with disabilities, women of racial, ethnic, religious minorities in different groups like this. We need to understand how these multiple identities are impacting this field. And I would include very importantly in that elite women versus not, and also opposition women versus incumbent party women. And I've written on this in the past, but there's a significant divide in that as well. Incumbent parties in authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes tend to be really good at having women in politics for a variety of reasons. And not good reasons. So we need to be conscious of these things. We need to be investigating them, analyzing them very carefully and critically, and looking at these things from cross perspectives. On the question of closed authoritarian regimes, I mean, there's no justice for anyone, right? That's the nature of the beast. But human rights organizations and others are very active in these countries, either in the countries or working as diaspora or in exile, using social media, using the internet. And we've seen these campaigns really proliferate in different places. I mean, IT-based systems are being used in Syria, for example, to understand what the nature of the violence is going on there, and to report on it and to give transparency and voice to those people that are subject to it. So there's that, and having the information is at least the first step towards justice. But I would also end on a note of caution. Working with closed authoritarian regimes, especially using technology-based messaging, whether that is sophisticated internet-based things or whether it is more classic things like, I don't know, throwing pamphlets or USB sticks into North Korea or something like that. Those have gendered impacts as well that we need to be aware of. So the North Korean case is a case in point. Democracy activists have long been trying to get democratic messages, what is life like in democracies, into North Korea, which ostensibly, is opening people's eyes to what that could be like, a positive thing. But 85% of defectors out of North Korea are women. Many of them are motivated by these images of democracy in the Western world. And if they're defecting based on that idea, they're going into China where they're most immediately brought into sexual slavery and human trafficking situations. So we need to be aware of the gendered impacts of using new technologies to promote participation, awareness, democratic values as well.
So we are over time, so I'd like to thank the panelists, but also I think if any of you didn't get a chance to ask a question that you'd like to ask to them, maybe afterwards, if they're available, I'm sure if they can spare the time, they would be happy to respond to you. But can we give them a hand and say thank you all for your interest?